70 million. That's how many people served in uniform during World War II. 70 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines from every continent on Earth. They came from democracies and dictatorships, free nations and occupied territories, cities and villages, farms and factories. And here's the question that haunts us 80 years later. Were they all fighting for freedom? The Allied soldiers, Americans, British, Canadians, Soviets, French, Polish, Chinese, we say they fought for freedom. They fought against fascism, against tyranny, against genocide. They liberated concentration camps. They freed occupied nations. They restored democracy. But what about the individual soldier? The 19-year-old rifleman charging a beach at Normandy? The tank commander fighting street by street through Stalingrad? The pilot flying his 50th mission over Germany, knowing the odds say he won't survive? Were they thinking about freedom? Or were they just trying to survive the next 5 minutes? This is the story of World War II soldiers, not the generals or the politicians, not the grand strategy or the geopolitics, the soldiers. The men who did the fighting and dying, their stories of courage and fear, heroism and horror, sacrifice and survival. Because freedom isn't an abstract concept when you're crouched in a foxhole with artillery shells exploding around you. Freedom isn't a philosophical debate when you're storming a machine gun nest. Freedom is what you're supposedly fighting for while death is trying to find you every second of every day. This is World War II, not from the history books, from the soldiers who lived it, who fought for something they called freedom, even when freedom felt very far away. The brutal reality. Let's start with the truth that gets sanitized in history books. World War II combat was hell on earth. The average infantryman's experience was terror, exhaustion, filth, and death. You carried 60 pounds of equipment. You marched until your feet bled. You slept in mud. You ate cold rations. You went days without bathing. You watched friends die in ways no human should die. American soldier Audie Murphy, who would become the most decorated U.S. soldier of the war, described it simply, "I was scared all the time." Anyone who says they weren't scared is lying. You learned to function while terrified. That was the skill, not being brave, but functioning despite the fear. The Pacific Theater was particularly brutal. Heat, humidity, disease. Japanese soldiers who would rather die than surrender. Americans who learned to stop taking prisoners because it was too dangerous. Islands fought over for months, yard by yard, cave by cave. Marine Eugene Sledge fought on Peleliu and Okinawa. His description: "The war was brutality and violence beyond anything civilians can imagine. We became something less than human. You had to survive. The things I saw, the things I did, I wouldn't talk about them for 30 years because I was ashamed, not of cowardice, of what I'd become." The European theater wasn't better, just different. Frozen winters where soldiers lost toes to frostbite. Hedgerow fighting in Normandy, where every field was a potential death trap. Artillery barrages that could turn a forest into matchsticks and the men inside into pieces. British soldier George MacDonald Fraser fought in Burma against the Japanese. He wrote, "War isn't heroic. It's terrifying and disgusting, and it makes you do things you never imagined you'd do. You shoot men who are trying to kill you. You see your friends blown apart. You keep going because stopping means dying." And then there were the moral dilemmas, the lines that got crossed, the things soldiers did that they couldn't reconcile with who they thought they were. American bomber crews dropped firebombs on German and Japanese cities, incinerating civilians by the hundreds of thousands. They knew what they were doing. They struggled with it. But they did it anyway, because those were the orders, and this was total war. Soviet soldiers raped their way across Germany in 1945. Revenge for what the Nazis had done to their country. Did that make it right? No. Did they do it anyway? Yes. War unleashes the worst in people along with the best. Freedom, that's what they said they were fighting for. But in the moment, freedom was an abstraction, Survival was concrete. The man trying to kill you was real. Everything else was distant. Stories of courage. But within the horror, there was also extraordinary courage. Not the Hollywood kind, the real kind. The kind where terrified men did what needed to be done despite everything in them screaming to run. June 6, 1944. D-Day, Omaha Beach. First Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith landed with the first wave at 6:30 a.m. He was supposed to lead his men off the beach, across the seawall and inland. Instead, he landed in a killing zone. German machine guns swept the beach from fortified positions. Men were cut down before they got out of the landing craft. Bodies floated in the surf. The beach was chaos. Men huddled behind obstacles, pinned down, unable to advance. Monteith could have stayed down. No one would have blamed him. Instead, he stood up. He rallied his men. He led them across the beach under direct fire. He personally destroyed 2 machine gun positions with grenades. He organized the breakthrough that got men off that beach. He died later that day, shot by a sniper. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. But here's what matters. Monteith wasn't a superhero. He was a 24-year-old teacher from North Carolina who was terrified like everyone else. He just chose to act anyway. That's courage, not the absence of fear, the decision to function despite it. October 1944. The Philippines. Private First Class. John McKinney, an American soldier, was on guard duty when 300 Japanese soldiers attacked his position. His unit was overrun. Everyone else was killed or captured. McKinney was alone. He had 1 rifle and whatever ammunition he could scavenge from dead soldiers. For 4 hours he fought. He fired until his rifle barrel was too hot to touch. He used his bayonet when they got close. He used grenades. He used captured Japanese weapons. When reinforcements arrived at dawn, they found McKinney still alive, surrounded by over 100 dead Japanese soldiers. He'd held the position alone for 4 hours against overwhelming numbers. Medal of Honor. But ask McKinney, and he said, "I wasn't brave. I was too scared to run. I just kept shooting because that's all I could do." These stories repeat across every theater. Soviet sniper Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a woman in a male-dominated military, recorded 309 confirmed kills. She wasn't superhuman. She was determined and skilled and refused to accept that women couldn't fight. British Commando Robert Henry Kane fought at Arnhem during Operation Market Garden. When German Tiger tanks attacked his position, he had only a PIAT anti-tank weapon, notoriously unreliable. He destroyed multiple tanks while wounded and exhausted. Why? Because if I didn't, the tanks would kill everyone, so I kept firing. Chinese soldiers fought the Japanese with outdated equipment and little support. The Battle of Shanghai in 1937 saw Chinese defenders hold out for 3 months against superior Japanese forces. Why? Because it was their country, their homes, their families. Freedom wasn't abstract, it was everything they had. The common thread in all these stories isn't superhuman ability. It's ordinary people pushed beyond what they thought they could endure. And somehow, they endured anyway. The Stalingrad story. If any battle exemplifies World War II's fight for freedom and its cost, it's Stalingrad, August 1942 through February 1943. 6 months of the most brutal urban combat in history. The Soviet Union versus Nazi Germany. Freedom versus tyranny. Survival versus annihilation. The Germans needed Stalingrad. It was a major industrial city and a key transportation hub on the Volga River. More importantly, it bore Stalin's name. Capturing it would be a propaganda victory. Hitler ordered it taken at any cost. The Soviets needed to hold Stalingrad. If it fell, the Germans could cut off oil supplies from the Caucasus. More importantly, losing the city bearing Stalin's name would be a devastating blow to morale. Stalin ordered it held at any cost. So 2 armies fought for a city, and the city became hell. Soviet soldier Vasily Grossman, a war correspondent embedded with the 62nd Army, described it. "This is not war. This is the end of the world. Buildings are rubble. The river is on fire from burning oil. Dead bodies are everywhere. German, Soviet, civilian. You can't bury them. You just fight around them until they're blown to pieces or rot." The fighting was measured in meters. You'd fight all day to capture one building. The next day, you'd fight to hold it. Individual floors of factories changed hands multiple times. Soldiers fought room to room, floor to floor, sometimes with grenades and bayonets because rifles were useless at that range. Soviet sniper Vasily Zaitsev became famous for dueling German snipers among the ruins. But fame didn't change the reality. Every day I woke up knowing I might die. Every shot I took could give away my position. Every German I killed meant his friends would hunt me. But if I didn't kill them, they'd kill my comrades. So I kept shooting. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving at Stalingrad was 24 hours. Think about that. You cross the Volga River under artillery fire. You land in the ruins. You're given a rifle and told to hold your position. 24 hours later, statistically, you're dead. Why did they fight? Soviet propaganda said they were fighting for Stalin, for communism, for the motherland, and some believed that. But talk to the survivors, and a different answer emerges. They fought because surrendering to the Nazis meant death anyway. They fought because this was their country and the Germans were invaders. They fought because everyone around them was fighting and you couldn't let your comrades down. German soldiers were equally trapped. They'd been told Stalingrad would fall quickly. Instead, they were ground down in urban warfare for which they weren't trained. They were exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly demoralized. But orders were orders. Hitler said, "Take the city," so they tried. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote in his diary in September 1942, "We are attacking every day. We capture buildings. Then the Russians counterattack and we lose them. My company started with 90 men. We have 32 left. When will this end?" Hoffmann's diary stops in November 1942. He likely died in the fighting or during the subsequent surrender and captivity. By November 1942, the Germans had captured most of Stalingrad but couldn't finish off the Soviet defenders clinging to a narrow strip along the Volga. Then the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that encircled the entire German 6th Army. 300,000 German soldiers were trapped. Hitler ordered them to hold, no retreat, no surrender. They would be supplied by air until relieved, except the Luftwaffe couldn't supply an entire army by air, and relief never came. The Germans starved, they froze. The Russian winter of 1942-43 was brutal, and they lacked winter equipment. They ran out of ammunition. They ate their horses. They burned furniture to stay warm. And still, they were ordered to hold. On February 2nd, 1943, the remnants of the 6th Army surrendered. Of the 300,000 trapped, 91,000 were taken prisoner. Only about 6,000 would survive Soviet captivity to return to Germany after the war. The rest died of starvation, disease, cold, or were worked to death in labor camps. Stalingrad cost both sides approximately 2 million casualties, killed, wounded, captured, for a single city. Was it worth it? From a strategic perspective, yes. Stalingrad was a turning point. The Germans never recovered. The Soviets proved they could not only resist, but defeat the Wehrmacht. The myth of German invincibility died at Stalingrad. But from an individual soldier's perspective, that's harder. If you were one of the survivors, if you endured that hell and lived, maybe you could say it was worth it. If you were one of the millions who died, your perspective doesn't exist. You're just a statistic. Freedom. The Soviets called it defending the motherland. The Germans called it securing living space. Both sides claimed righteousness. Both sides fed men into a meat grinder for months. And in the end, 2 million people were casualties for one city. That's the reality of World War II. Freedom wasn't free. It cost lives measured in millions. And the soldiers who paid that cost rarely had philosophical debates about what freedom meant. They just fought and died and hoped it mattered. The aftermath. World War II ended in August 1945. 70 million people had served in uniform. Estimates suggest 21 to 25 million soldiers died. Add civilian deaths, and the war killed 70 to 85 million people total, the deadliest conflict in human history. But it wasn't just the dead. It was the survivors who carried the war with them, the physical wounds, the psychological scars, the memories that never faded. Many World War II veterans never talked about their experiences. When they came home, people would ask, "What was it like?" And they couldn't answer. How do you explain hell to someone who's never been there? How do you describe what you saw, what you did, what you became? So they stayed quiet. They went back to work, raised families, lived normal lives. But the war was always there, in nightmares, in flinches at loud noises, in moments of sudden darkness when they'd remember something they'd buried for decades. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that many veterans started talking openly. Books of oral history captured their stories. Documentaries interviewed them. Schools invited them to speak, and a generation that had stayed silent for 40 years started sharing what they'd endured. What comes through in these stories is complexity. War wasn't glorious. It wasn't an adventure. It was brutal and traumatic and left scars that never fully healed. But many veterans also expressed pride in what they'd done. They'd stopped fascism. They'd liberated concentration camps. They'd freed occupied countries. Whatever the cost to themselves, they'd accomplished something that mattered. Tom Brokaw called them the greatest generation. The generation that fought the war, then came home and built the post-war world. The interstate highway system, the GI Bill that sent millions to college, the economic boom of the 1950s and 60s, all built by men who'd survived hell and wanted something better. But that label, greatest generation, makes some veterans uncomfortable. Eugene Sledge, the Marine who fought in the Pacific, said, "We weren't the greatest generation. We were just the generation that happened to be there when the war started. We did what we had to do. Nothing more. Don't make us into heroes. We were just trying to survive." Maybe that's the most honest assessment. They weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people put in extraordinary circumstances. Some rose to heroism. Others just endured. Many died. But all of them contributed to defeating the greatest evil of the 20th century. Conclusion. 70 million soldiers fought in World War II. They came from every nation, every background, every walk of life. They fought in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. They endured conditions we can barely imagine. And millions of them never came home. Were they fighting for freedom? It's complicated. Allied soldiers were fighting against fascism and tyranny, which is as close to fighting for freedom as war gets. But in the moment, most soldiers weren't thinking about abstract concepts. They were thinking about surviving the next 5 minutes, protecting the men beside them, and maybe, if they were lucky, going home when it was over. What's undeniable is the sacrifice. 25 million soldiers died. Millions more were wounded physically or psychologically. Entire nations mobilized their populations for total war. And the generation that fought carried those scars for the rest of their lives. But they also left us a world without Nazi Germany, without the Japanese Empire's occupation of Asia, without fascism as a dominant global force. The cost was horrific. But the alternative, letting the Axis win, was unthinkable. So we remember them, not as perfect heroes, not as infallible warriors, but as human beings who did extraordinarily difficult things in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, who fought despite fear, who endured despite suffering, who sacrificed so future generations wouldn't have to. The last World War II veterans are dying now. Soon, there will be none left. Their first-hand accounts will be gone. We'll be left with their words, their stories, preserved in books and videos and archives, and the responsibility to remember what they did and why it mattered. Because freedom isn't free. That's not just a slogan. It's a truth paid for in blood by millions of soldiers who fought and died so we could live in a world where freedom exists. We owe them memory. We owe them gratitude. And we owe them the responsibility to never let what they fought against rise again. 70 million soldiers, 25 million dead. One question: were they fighting for freedom? The answer is yes, even when freedom felt distant. Even when survival was the only goal. They were fighting to defeat tyranny, and that's the closest thing to fighting for freedom that exists in war.
Remember them, honor them, and never forget what they sacrificed so we could be free.